I'm Nora Whitaker. 31 years old and a week before Christmas, I stood by my apartment window in Chicago with my phone pressed to my ear, Palm's damp voice steadying as I told my parents I'd be home this year. The line was busy with clinks and laughter. On their end, a holiday hum that didn't leave space for me. Then my mother said, "It calm clipped, final. Don't come back, Nora. This year is for special people." The radiator hissed a tired sound in the quiet room, and I stared at the envelope on my table holding glossy photos of a little white house and a black SUV meant to be surprises. My father's cheer floated in from Florida, my brother Jason's low chuckle, and I found my breath going thin like winter air. What a shame, I heard myself say, not unkind, just done. I hung up, opened the family group text, attached the photos, and wrote, "Too bad you just missed a special gift." Then I turned the screen face down and waited for the silence to tell me the truth I already knew. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments. And if you've ever had to stand your ground with Family Tap, that like and subscribe, so more voices like ours can be heard. I grew up in a small Ohio town where winter bit through your coat and neighbors waved from behind frosted windows, where our church potluck stretched 2 folding tables long, and my mother taught me that kindness starts with quiet hands, not loud promises. My father worked long shifts, came home with the smell of machine oil in his jacket, and used to say that Whitakers pull their own weight, which I took to mean you show up early, prepared and grateful for the chance. I worked summers at the library shelving books. No one checked out anymore. Learned patience from the creak of the book cart's wheel and saved coins in a jar for things that mattered. A used laptop, secondhand textbooks, bus fare. Jason shined on varsity courts and birthday photos, quick with a grin and quicker with attention, while I learned to tuck my own wins into small drawers. Still, I believed that steady effort would earn steady love, and for a long time that was enough to keep me moving. When I left for Chicago after college, the change felt like stepping into a different weather system. Rent came due whether you slept or not, coffee tasted like work, and the sidewalks pulsed with people who wouldn't know you if you vanished between stoplights. I coded at a repair shop that smelled like dust, and burnt circuits took on freelance gigs that paid late and kept a paper planner so full of pencil marks it looked like a storm map. I ate bulk oatmeal, learned to mend seams, and told myself that a new life doesn't require permission. The contrast between my one-room walk-up and the photographs my parents sent from a Florida beach house never bothered me until I realized the distance wasn't miles, it was attention. When Stepwise, the health app I built at night, was acquired for more money than I had words for, I didn't move right away, kept the same chipped mugs, the same thrift store table, thinking I would share the news in person at Christmas and let the celebration be a bridge we could walk across together. I bought a simple square of a house for my parents, the kind with a front porch you can sweep in 10 minutes, and a kitchen window that makes morning light feel like a blessing. For Jason, I chose the SUV he'd mentioned a dozen times, the model he said would be perfect for road trips, with the kids he was sure he'd have. I put the deed and a pair of keys in an envelope and left it beside the tiny tree in my living room, certain that gifts couldn't fix history but might soften the edges of it. When I called and heard special people, the words settled in my chest like a stone I'd been carrying for years without naming, and the room got very still. My phone lit with texts, my mother's sudden sweetness, my father's. "Let's talk this out." Jason's quick question mark, and I understood that I was finally the one who decided when the conversation began and when it ended. I turned off the ringer, poured water from the tap, and told myself to sleep. The city kept breathing outside, steady and indifferent, and I let its rhythm quiet the ache. Morning brought the same winter light, the same envelope, the same truth. I worked through a list in my head, laundry, grocery run, the bakery on the corner that still takes cash because ordinary tasks can anchor you when the ground underneath starts to shift. I looked again at the photos I'd sent and at the clean lines of that little house, a place where love could have taken root, and I felt something unclench. I didn't answer the calls that followed, not out of spite, but to protect the small, calm space I had made. The word special hung there, familiar as my name, and I knew it hadn't started on a phone call from Florida. It began somewhere much earlier in a room where laughter skipped over me like I wasn't there at all, and the memory of that night is where this story needs to go next. When I was 7, I learned what it meant to be invisible. The living room glowed with gold light from our Christmas tree, its branches sagging under red glass ornaments that caught reflections of my brother's grin. Jason sat cross-legged by the fireplace, ripping through box after box wrapped in bright paper. My mother clapped her hands laughing each time he shouted with excitement. A Lego set, a model train, a pair of sneakers still stuffed with tissue paper. I sat nearby holding a single package with my name written small in the corner. Inside was a used science book, its corners bent, and a note taped to the cover in my mother's tidy handwriting study. Hard, Nora. I smiled, said thank you, and she nodded without looking up, already handing Jason his next gift. Later that night, when the house went quiet, I buried my face in the pillow so no one would hear me cry. The pattern never changed. By the time I turned 12, winter in Ohio had sharpened into something cruel. The wind cut straight through the cracks around our windows, and the snow piled high along the porch steps. One morning before school, Jason came down wearing a new down jacket, the tag still dangling from the sleeve. My father looked proud, said a boy needed to stay warm. I tugged on the old coat they'd passed down to me, the zipper stuck halfway, and the sleeves riding up past my wrists. "This doesn't fit," I said quietly. My father didn't lower his newspaper. "You're old enough to manage Nora." Jason spun in a slow circle, arms stretched wide. "It's so warm," he said, and I nodded. My fingers were already turning pink from the cold. I told myself it didn't matter. I'd make do. That winter I learned how silence could sting worse than frostbite. As I got older, I stopped asking for much. When I was 16, a teacher posted a flyer for a free art program. All I needed were the supplies, paints, brushes, paper. I brought the flyer home and waited until after dinner, then slid it across the table. "Could I try this?" I asked. My mother frowned, wiping her hands on a towel. "We don't have money for that kind of thing, sweetheart. Jason's tutoring is expensive and he needs to stay ahead." I started to explain that the program was mostly free, that it might even help me win a small scholarship. She didn't let me finish. "Enough, Nora. Your brother's future comes first. You're strong, you'll figure something out." I folded the paper, tucked it into my pocket, and went to my room. That night, I traced the outline of the program's logo on scrap paper and then tore it to pieces before I could dream about it any longer. The difference between us grew in small ways that didn't always show until they did. Jason's report cards hung on the fridge in shiny magnets. Mine stayed buried in drawers. When neighbors came over, my mother bragged about his basketball games and his leadership awards. If she mentioned me, it was only to say I'd always been independent. That word independent became the wall between us. I began to believe it meant unworthy of help, someone who existed on the edge of their attention. On Jason's 10th birthday, my mother baked a tall chocolate cake layered in frosting. The smell filled the house, sweet and warm. I stood beside her at the counter, helping sprinkle colored sugar across the top. When the candles were lit, Jason leaned forward, cheeks flushed from excitement. "Can I have a piece too?" I asked after he blew them out. My mother smiled distractedly. "You're too grown up for cake, Nora. Have a cookie instead." She handed me one from a tin on the counter. It was dry, crumbling at the edges. I held it like a prize and tried not to notice the laughter spilling around me. Those early years built quiet habits I carried into everything that came after. I learned to nod, to smile, to disappear at the right moments. I learned to listen instead of speak. Sometimes I'd sit by my bedroom window with a notebook drawing the backyard in pencil while Jason's friends shouted in the driveway. The house always seemed to tilt toward him, his laughter echoing down hallways, his trophies lined on shelves, his photos framed in the living room. Mine were stored in a shoebox under the bed. My mother once said that Jason needed confidence, that boys thrived on praise. Girls, she said, needed grit. I believed her. I told myself that if I worked hard enough, if I kept proving myself, they'd see me eventually. But the truth was simpler. They didn't look. When I was 14, the cold came early again. I'd taken on a small newspaper route, waking before dawn, to pedal through the fog. The air stung my cheeks and the ink from the papers stained my gloves black. Neighbors sometimes waved from their porches. "Hard-working girl," they'd say, and those words felt warmer than anything waiting at home. By breakfast, Jason would already be dressed neatly for school, his new sneakers spotless. My mother would glance at me, hair damp from the mist, and sigh. "You're always in such a rush, Nora. Look at your brother, he takes pride in his appearance." Jason grinned, flicking crumbs from his plate. Maybe she just likes looking messy. I bit down on a piece of toast until my jaw ached and said nothing. At 15, I started taking evening shifts at the local diner. The smell of fry grease stuck to my clothes, but the pay helped cover school supplies. One night, I came home close to midnight. My father was still awake, the blue light from the television flickering across the room. "Where have you been?" he asked, eyes still on the screen. "Work," I said. He nodded slowly, barely interested. "Don't let it affect Jason's studying. He needs quiet." I wanted to ask if he'd ever wondered whether I needed anything too, but the words never came out. I went to my room and let the door click shut behind me. The walls there felt safer than any conversation could. By 16, exhaustion had settled into my bones. I'd go from school to work, then home to homework, the hours blurring together. Most mornings I ran on instant coffee and vending machine snacks. My eyes burned from lack of sleep, but no one noticed. One evening I walked in to find my parents beaming while Jason showed off a new phone. "It'll help him stay connected for study groups," my mother said proudly. I nodded, setting my bag down quietly. "Don't be jealous, Nora," she added. "You've always been independent. You can manage on your own." The phrase landed heavy like an old bruise pressed too hard. I smiled because that's what they expected and said, "Of course, Mom." But later that night, sitting on my bed, I whispered the words back to myself, "You can manage." I wondered when that had stopped sounding like strength and started sounding like a sentence. At 17, I tried one more time to be seen. I'd just won an award for a programming project, something my teacher said could lead to a scholarship. I came home bubbling with the news, still holding the certificate in my hands. "Mom," I began. She cut me off, waving toward Jason's room. "That's wonderful, honey. Now help your brother with his essay. He's so stressed." I froze. "But Nora," she said sharply, "he needs you. Don't be selfish." The words snapped something quiet inside me. I sat at Jason's desk that night typing paragraphs he barely read, and when he handed it in the next morning, my name wasn't anywhere on it. That was the moment I understood what I'd been to them all along, a background note in someone else's song. The day I left for college, there were no hugs or packed lunches. My father carried one suitcase to the car, set it down, and patted my shoulder. "Make us proud, kiddo," he said, the same thing he told Jason before every basketball game. My mother reminded me to call when I could, but not to expect help with bills. Jason was planning his engagement then, and she said weddings were expensive. I nodded, thanked them both, and promised to stay in touch. When the bus pulled away from the curb, I watched the town shrink in the window until the streets blurred into fields. I felt the ache of leaving, but beneath it was something steadier, a pulse of freedom I didn't yet know how to name. Years later, I'd look back and see how those small slights added up, how each dismissal built the quiet armor I still wore. But at the time, I just kept moving forward, believing effort could replace love, that hard work could fill the spaces where warmth should have been. I carried those lessons with me into every job, every late night, every coded line of my future. And somewhere between the exhaustion and the silence, I began to understand that if I ever wanted to be seen, I'd have to step out of their shadow entirely. What I didn't know then was how far that realization would take me, or how much it would cost to finally walk away. College life felt like trading one kind of struggle for another. I arrived with a half scholarship, one battered suitcase, and the conviction that I could survive anything if I worked hard enough. The first night in this dorm, I sat on a narrow bed listening to the hum of laughter from the hallway, wondering if independence would feel like this quiet, heavy, and cold. My classes started at dawn, and by evening I was folding aprons in a small diner a few blocks from campus, the smell of grease clinging to my hair long after closing. The paycheck barely covered books, but I learned to stretch every dollar until it thinned like paper. During those months, I moved through days like someone sprinting uphill. Between lectures, I studied in empty classrooms where the lights buzzed overhead, then rode my bike across town to the computer repair shop that hired students willing to work nights. The place smelled of burnt plastic and instant coffee, the counters stacked with cracked screens and old motherboards. I swept the floor-sorted cables and listened to the soft click of keyboards as I learned small repairs from the older techs. Sometimes they'd ask about my family and I'd shrug, saying they lived out of state. It was easier than explaining the truth that distance didn't start with geography. Most nights ended with me back in my dorm after midnight, a half-eaten sandwich on the desk, and pages of notes still waiting. I set alarms for 3-hour naps, telling myself this was temporary. My classmates posted pictures of road trips and concerts, and I scrolled past them, telling myself I'd have time for joy later. At 19, later felt like a promise I could still believe in. It was one of those long nights in the campus library when an idea took hold that wouldn't let go. I'd been studying for an exam surrounded by students wearing expensive fitness trackers that blinked like tiny trophies on their wrists. I didn't own one, couldn't even think about buying one, but I kept wondering why staying healthy had to cost so much. On the walk back to my dorm, I pulled out a worn notebook and scribbled a question. What if tracking your health didn't depend on what you could afford? That line became the seed for what would eventually be Stepwise. I started sketching ideas between shifts, coding whenever I could steal an hour at the shop. My laptop overheated constantly, forcing me to balance it on a metal tray so it wouldn't burn out. I taught myself new coding languages by watching free tutorials, rewinding the same videos over and over until the logic clicked. The first version of Stepwise barely worked. It crashed if you tapped too fast, drained the battery in minutes, and miscounted steps by hundreds. Still, I released it online, heart-pounding as I clicked publish. The next morning I checked for downloads and saw 10.8 from classmates I'd begged to try it. Then came the reviews' slow, buggy waste of time. I read them all and felt every word like a small bruise. One night, after another long shift, I sat on the floor of my room staring at my cracked phone screen. The app icon blinked faintly, a tiny shape against the black background. I thought about deleting everything, starting fresh, maybe giving up, but something in me refused. I remembered the mornings I used to deliver newspapers through the frost, how I'd pedaled through the dark because no one else would do it for me. That same stubbornness was still there waiting. I picked up the phone and said out loud to the empty room, "Try again." From then on, every spare minute went into fixing Stepwise. I patched bugs, simplified features, and redesigned the layout until it looked clean and friendly. I printed small flyers at the campus copy shop, taping them to bulletin boards and coffee shop doors. Some nights I stayed awake until sunrise answering questions from users online. The growth was slow at first, but steady: 50 downloads, then 100, then more. Kind messages began to replace the angry ones. "Helps me stay motivated," one read. "Better than I expected," said another. For the first time, I saw proof that my work mattered to someone outside my family's narrow circle of praise. When the numbers started climbing past 1,000, I called home. It had been weeks since I'd heard their voices, and even through the distance I felt that old hope rise up. Maybe they'd be proud this time. My father answered on the second ring. "Dad, I said I built an app Stepwise. People are actually using it. I think it might take off." There was a pause, then his dry laugh. "Apps don't pay the bills, Nora. Be practical. Jason just got promoted to manager. Now that's something real." I forced a smile, even though he couldn't see it. "That's great for him," I said. The line went quiet, and I knew he'd already moved on to something else. After that call, I stopped waiting for their approval. I threw myself into work until months blurred together. Stepwise kept growing inch by inch, review by review. The extra income covered more than bills now. I could afford a better laptop, new software, and even an apartment off campus. I still lived simply secondhand furniture, cheap coffee, but I started to feel capable in a way I never had before. Then one morning an email appeared that made me freeze mid-sip of coffee. It was from a tech firm in Chicago. "We've been following your app's progress. Would you consider a collaboration?" I read it twice, then 3 times just to be sure. My hands shook as I typed a reply, trying to sound calm. Weeks later, they invited me to meet their team. Walking into that downtown office felt like stepping into another world. The lobby gleamed with glass and steel, the city skyline stretching beyond the windows. I sat across from 3 executives in tailored suits as they praised my work and slid a contract across the table. "We'd like to acquire Stepwise." One of them said, $5.4 million. My pulse thundered in my ears, but I managed to answer steadily, 5.6. They exchanged glances, then smiled. "Deal." When I signed my name, I felt years of exhaustion lift all at once, replaced by a silence so deep it rang in my chest. That night, back in my small apartment, I stared at the numbers in my bank account until they blurred. I should have been ecstatic, but the joy didn't come. The first instinct was still the same one I'd had since childhood, to call home. My mother picked up her voice, distracted. "Mom," I said, "the company bought my app." "Millions, Mom." 5.6 million. There was a pause long enough for me to think the line had dropped. Then she said, "That's nice, honey. Did you hear Jason's managing a whole team now? We're planning a party." I sat there holding the phone, listening to her talk about cake flavors and invitations. When she finally said, "Don't be jealous, Nora. You've always managed fine on your own." I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. "Of course," I said softly, and hung up. The following weeks passed like a blur. I kept my same apartment, the same old dishes, the same worn coat. I told myself it wasn't about showing off. It was about knowing I could. Still at night, when the city went quiet, I caught myself imagining how it might feel to hear them say, "We're proud of you." That single sentence had become the one thing money couldn't buy. It was around that time that the idea for a gift began forming in my mind, a gesture to close the distance between us once and for all. My parents had always dreamed of a house with a white fence and a little garden. Jason had bragged for years about wanting a sleek black SUV. I had more than enough to give them both. Maybe if I did, they'd finally see me not as the one who managed, but as the daughter who came through. As I signed the last papers for the purchases, I told myself it wasn't revenge or repayment. It was hope, pure and simple. I wanted Christmas to be the beginning of something new, a clean slate, a reason for them to look at me with pride. The gifts were ready, the photos printed, and the call home already marked on my calendar. I didn't know it yet, but that hope would be the last fragile thread holding our family together, and soon it would snap. By the time December arrived, the cold in Chicago had settled deep into the bones of the city. Snow clung to rooftops like heavy frosting, and every window glowed with strings of colored lights. I'd kept the same small apartment for years, but that winter it felt different. Tidy, warm, almost peaceful. The envelope on my kitchen table held the final paperwork for the house I'd bought for my parents. Next to it lay the glossy photo of the black SUV Jason had once said he'd give anything to own. I ran my fingers across the images, feeling both excitement and nerves twist together. I imagined my mother's face softening when she saw what I'd done, my father speechless for once, Jason maybe even grateful. It was naive, but I wanted that one moment when everything could be right again. The week before Christmas, I called home to tell them I'd be visiting. The phone rang several times before my mother answered. "Mom, it's me," I said, trying to sound light. "I'll be home for Christmas this year." There was a pause. Faint chatter in the background, then her voice thinned, distracted. "Oh, Nora, we're actually in Florida this year. Jason invited us down. It's just family this time." I hesitated. "Well, I'm family, aren't I?" She sighed, the kind of sigh that came before something she didn't want to explain. "You know what I mean, sweetheart. Jason's kids, Kelly's parents. It's for special people. I thought I'd misheard her." "Special people?" I asked quietly. "Mom, I'm your daughter." But she was already half listening to someone else in the room. Laughter echoed through the line, Jason's voice booming somewhere nearby. My father called out for more drinks, and she barely heard me say goodbye. The silence that followed was sharp enough to sting. I sat there for a long time, the phone still in my hand, the words still hanging in the air. Then I whispered to the empty room, "What a pity. I had something special, too." I turned the phone face down and stared at the tiny Christmas tree in the corner. Its lights flickered across the window glass, and for a moment I could almost see my reflection as a child sitting under the same kind of glow, waiting for their attention. I picked up the envelope, slid the photos of the house and car inside, and opened the family group chat. My fingers hesitated only once before I typed, "Too bad you just missed out on a special gift." I attached the pictures and pressed send. Then I set the phone down and poured myself a glass of wine. The first vibration came before I even lifted the glass. Then another, and another. Within minutes, the screen lit up like a siren. Messages poured in my mother's name, my father's Jason's. "Call me back." "What is this?" "You can't be serious. I didn't read them." I let the screen buzz against the tabletop, each vibration dull and rhythmic. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry, so I did neither. I just watched the tree lights blink in time with the phone until both became a blur. When I finally looked again, there were dozens of missed calls. By midnight, there were 88. My phone had never seen that much attention from them in all the years I'd owned it. I picked it up just once, when my mother called again. Her voice came through shaky, high-pitched with panic. "Nora, sweetheart, listen. We didn't mean it like that. You are special. You've always been special. Please, let's talk about this." Her tone trembled on the edge of something that sounded like desperation, but underneath it was something older, familiar, a hunger I recognized too well. "Mom," I said softly, "you had 30 years to see me. Now you finally notice because of a house and a car." She said my name again, her breath catching, but I didn't answer. I ended the call and placed the phone back on the table. The quiet that followed didn't hurt the way I thought it would. It was almost peaceful. I sat by the window watching snow drift through the streetlights outside. Each flake fell slow and steady, vanishing when it hit the pavement. I thought of all the years I'd been chasing warmth from people who only knew how to stand in the sun themselves. Somewhere deep down, the ache I'd carried since childhood began to ease just a little. I whispered to the glass, "You've given enough." The next morning, I woke to find sunlight pouring through the blinds. My phone still blinked with messages, "Apologies, please, confusion," but I didn't open them. I brewed coffee, wrapped a scarf around my neck, and walked outside. The streets were muffled with snow, the kind that softened every sound. I passed families hauling shopping bags, couples laughing under shared umbrellas, and children dragging sleds down icy sidewalks. My chest tightened, but not from longing, just understanding. Family wasn't about shared blood. It was about being seen, being safe, being wanted. Later that afternoon, I stopped by the post office to mail a few packages, small donations to charities I'd been meaning to support. The woman behind the counter smiled, asked if I had plans for the holidays. "Just a quiet one this year," I said. She nodded knowingly. "Sometimes those are the best kind." Her kindness caught me off guard. It reminded me that warmth didn't have to come from where we expected it. That evening, as the city dimmed, I sat again by the window, my small tree glowing softly beside me. I watched the snow swirl outside like a slow dance, my phone silent for the first time all day. My thoughts drifted to the years I'd spent trying to earn their love, every gift, every call, every compromise. None of it had changed what they were willing to give. This time I wouldn't chase what was never mine to keep. I took a sip of wine and turned off the lamp, the room filled with nothing but the sound of snow tapping gently against the glass. For the first time in my life, that silence didn't feel lonely. It felt like something new was beginning, something calm and solid. The ache was still there, but lighter, like the last ember of a fire that had finally burned itself out. I knew they would keep calling, maybe even show up one day to apologize, but it wouldn't matter anymore. I wasn't waiting to be chosen. I'd already chosen myself. The next few days moved slowly, each one quieter than the last. I worked a little read-through scholarship applications for a program I'd started funding in my old college's name and watched the snow outside melt into patches of gray. When Christmas morning came, I made coffee, turned on soft music, and opened the curtains wide. The light spilled across the room bright and clean. My phone sitting on the counter blinked with new messages, my mother, my father, Jason. I let it ring once before flipping it face down again. I didn't know yet that this peace would be tested sooner than I thought. because 3 days after Christmas, just as I was starting to believe the storm had passed, someone knocked on my door. The sound was sharp, heavy, deliberate. I froze, heart racing, listening to the knock echo through the apartment. Part of me already knew who it was. I set down my mug, crossed the room, and reached for the handle. When I opened the door, the cold air rushed in, and standing there were my parents and Jason. When I opened the door, the winter air hit like a slap. My mother stood in front, her cheeks red from the cold, eyes rimmed with exhaustion. My father hovered behind her, shifting his weight from foot to foot, and Jason crossed his arms, tight, jaw clenched. For a long moment, no one said a word. I gripped the doorframe, my pulse steady but firm. My mother finally broke the silence. "Thank God you're here," she breathed, voice trembling. "We just want to talk." Her eyes darted past me into the apartment, but I didn't move to let them in. "Talk," I said. "About what?" She took a step closer. "Sweetheart, don't be like this. About the house, the car we just didn't understand." The calm that filled me was something new, something cold and certain. I looked at her, then at my father, and said quietly, "Understand what, Mom? That I exist." My father cleared his throat, the same sound he always made before delivering an explanation that would smooth things over. "We made mistakes," he said, his voice lower than usual. "We didn't mean to push you away. You've always been our strong one, Nora. We thought you didn't need as much attention." His eyes flickered toward Jason as if that old excuse could still hold. "Always Jason," I said. "It's always about him." My voice came out calm, but it carried years of weight behind it. Every birthday, every Christmas, every conversation. You never asked how I was doing unless it had something to do with him. Jason's shoulders tensed and his voice cut through the cold air. "Hey, I didn't ask for that, okay? Don't put this all on me." I turned toward him. "You didn't have to ask. You took it because they gave it to you. You saw it every time they looked right past me. You saw it and you liked it." He looked away, jaw working, as if he might argue but couldn't find the words. "I didn't know you felt that way," he muttered. I almost laughed. "Didn't know? You watched me scrape through jobs, watched them ignore every achievement I had. You saw me come home in worn-out shoes while they saved up for your next promotion party. Don't tell me you didn't know." The hallway fell into silence again, heavy and close. My mother blinked, fast tears forming in her eyes. "We love you, Nora. You're our daughter. You've always been special to us." The words struck hard, colder than the air drifting in from the doorway. "Special," I said softly. "Now I'm special." After 30 years of being invisible, I finally matter because I have something you want. Her hand reached toward mine, but I stepped back. "Please," she whispered, "let us fix this." I looked at her face, familiar and strange all at once, and realized there was nothing left to fix. "No," I said quietly. "I gave you chances every Christmas, every birthday, every time I called, hoping you'd ask how I was doing. You looked away every single time. I don't need your apologies anymore. I don't need your approval. And I'm done buying love that should have been given freely." My father's voice cracked deeper than I'd ever heard it. "Nora, don't do this. We can start over. You can't just cut us off like we're nothing." I felt a tremor in my hands but kept my voice steady. "You had 30 years to hold me. You chose not to. I'm just choosing the same thing you did." Jason took a step forward, his tone sharp. "So that's it. You're done with us." I met his eyes without flinching. "No, Jason. You were done a long time ago. Tonight, I'm just making it official." For a long moment, none of us moved. My mother's breath came shallow, my father's eyes dropped to the floor, and Jason looked at me like he was seeing someone new and didn't know what to make of it. The heater inside my apartment hummed quietly, filling the space between us. Finally, I reached for the door and opened it wider, not to invite them in, but to show them the way out. "Thank you for coming," I said softly, "but this conversation is over." My mother's lips trembled as she turned to leave. My father paused as if he wanted to say something else, then followed her. Jason lingered last, his expression half anger, half disbelief. For once, I didn't look away. I waited until he finally stepped into the hall. The door clicked shut behind them, sealing the cold air outside. I leaned against it, my breath slow and uneven. The quiet that filled the room was heavy, but it wasn't the same silence that had haunted me before. This one was clean, like air after a storm. My hands were still shaking, but they weren't trembling from fear anymore. I walked to the window, the city lights stretching out across the snow. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed, then faded into nothing. I thought about the little girl I used to be sitting under a Christmas tree, waiting for someone to notice her. She had done everything right, studied hard, smiled through pain, kept believing love could be earned. That girl had waited long enough. The clock on the wall ticked softly, marking the end of something I couldn't name. I poured a small glass of wine and sat near the tree. The lights flickered against the glass, and I whispered, "This is the last Christmas I'll ever spend waiting." The words didn't sound bitter. They sounded true. Outside, snow began to fall again, coating the streets in quiet white. I didn't know what came next, only that it would be mine to decide. The years I'd spent trying to hold a family together had finally come to an end, and in their place was something I'd never known before freedom. That night, I stayed awake until morning. The world outside slowly shifted from darkness to pale blue light, the snow turning gold in the sunrise. When I finally closed my eyes, I knew this time I wouldn't wake up hoping for a call, a text, or an apology. The waiting was over. What I didn't realize then was that endings have a way of opening doors you don't expect. Because within weeks I would leave Chicago behind for good, stepping into a life that wasn't about proving anything to anyone, a life built on peace, not permission. And for the first time I'd begin to understand what family could truly mean. After that night, the city didn't feel the same. Chicago's noise had always comforted me, the rush of trains, the distant hum of traffic, but now it all sounded hollow, like a song I'd outgrown. The air through my apartment windows carried the same winter chill, but it no longer felt like home. I packed my things, slowly folding clothes into neat piles, sliding old notebooks into boxes, taping shut the life I had built in this small square space. Every sound echoed tape peeling cardboard, creasing footsteps crossing the floor. It wasn't sadness that filled me, not anymore. It was a quiet readiness. By mid-February, I had sold most of what I owned. The rest fit into 2 suitcases and a box of keepsakes photos. A few books, the first sketch of Stepwise written in my college notebook. I transferred the rest of my money into savings, booked a one-way ticket west, and stood at O'Hare Airport, watching the snow swirl against the runway lights. When the plane lifted through the clouds, I kept my hand pressed to the window, the skyline shrinking beneath me, until it disappeared completely. I didn't look back. The small coastal town I moved to in Oregon felt like another world. The air smelled of salt and pine, and gulls drifted over the gray waves below the cliffs. I rented a weathered cottage a few miles from the harbor, its white paint chipped by the wind, the porch creaking when I stepped onto it. But the moment I opened the door and felt the ocean breeze sweep through the empty rooms, I knew it was exactly what I needed. The silence here wasn't heavy. It was clean open. My days began to follow the rhythm of the tide. I'd wake early to the sound of waves against the rocks, make coffee, and walk barefoot across the cold wood floors while the light stretched through the windows. Some mornings I drove into town to the small bakery on Main Street where the owner, a woman named Ruth, always greeted me with a gentle smile and a question about the weather. She had the kind of warmth that asked nothing in return. It reminded me of what simple kindness could feel like when it wasn't tied to guilt or expectation. After settling in, I found a flyer posted near the community center about an art class. My hands lingered over the paper longer than I expected. I hadn't picked up a paintbrush since high school, not since the day my mother said art was a waste of time. But the thought of color, of movement, pulled at me. The following week I signed up. The class met on Tuesday evenings in a bright room that smelled faintly of turpentine and sea air. The instructor, a silver-haired woman named Margaret, moved slowly but spoke with a calm confidence that filled the space. Art isn't about perfection, she told us that first night. It's about paying attention. I stood before a blank canvas brush, trembling in my hand, and for a moment, all I saw was white. Then I dipped the brush into a pot of cobalt blue, drew a single line across the canvas, and something inside me loosened. Painting became my quiet ritual. Some days the strokes came easily, others the colors refused to blend. But each evening, as the sun sank into the Pacific, I felt more present than I had in years. Margaret often stopped by my easel to offer small suggestions, never criticism. Once she rested a hand on my shoulder and said, "You've got an artist's soul." Her words caught me off guard. No one in my life had ever said anything like that. I smiled, blinked back tears, and kept painting. Weeks turned into months. I started volunteering on weekends with a local group that built playgrounds for children from low-income neighborhoods. The first time I dug a shovel into the cold earth, my hands blistered, but I didn't care. The laughter of the kids who watched us work made the soreness worth it. One little boy with sandy hair wrapped his arms around my leg and said, "Thanks, lady. This playground's going to be awesome." I crouched down, ruffling his hair, and said, "You're welcome. You deserve it." That night, as I washed the dirt from my hands, I realized how right it felt to give something that wasn't measured by obligation. The community began to recognize my name, not because of Stepwise or money, but because I showed up. Ruth saved me a table at the bakery. Margaret invited me to her gallery's open house, and the playground team leader asked if I'd consider funding materials for another project. I agreed quietly, no announcements or speeches, just quiet help. For the first time, the things I gave didn't come with conditions or hidden hopes. One morning a week before summer, I received a letter in the mail. It was from a local high school student named Jamie, who had received a scholarship I'd anonymously sponsored through the town's education fund. His handwriting was uneven, his words careful. "Because of you, I'll be the first in my family to go to college. Thank you for believing in me." I sat at my kitchen table, tracing the ink on the page, feeling something warm settle in my chest. That word "believing" echoed long after I folded the letter away. By the end of the year, the cottage no longer felt like a refuge from the past. It felt like home. I filled the walls with paintings, most of them simple seascapes, and kept the guitar I'd bought from a thrift store leaning against the porch railing. On quiet nights, I played soft chords as the wind swept through the open windows. The ocean answered back with its steady rhythm, and together they sounded like peace. When December came again, I decorated a larger tree in the corner of my living room, draping it with lights and ornaments I'd chosen myself. On Christmas Eve, I hosted dinner for the friends I'd made Margaret Ruth and a few volunteers from the playground project. The table was covered with simple dishes, roasted chicken potatoes, fresh bread. We laughed about small things, the weather, the stubborn plumbing in the community hall, Ruth's endless collection of scarves. It wasn't a grand celebration, but the warmth in that room felt truer than any family gathering I'd ever known. Later that night, after everyone left, I stood on the porch with a glass of wine, watching the moonlight shimmer across the water. The air smelled of salt and pine, and the waves rolled in gentle and steady. My phone buzzed in my pocket, another message from my mother, another missed call from my father, a short text from Jason that read, "We need to talk." I looked at the screen for a long time, then set the phone on the railing and let the wind move it slightly. I didn't delete the messages, but I didn't open them either, not out of anger, but because I no longer needed to. The sound of the tide filled the space around me. I lifted my glass toward the horizon, the sea glowing faintly under the moonlight, and whispered, "This is family." The wind carried the words away, scattering them over the waves. Inside, the tree lights flickered softly, casting a warm reflection against the window. For the first time, I wasn't waiting for anyone to come home. Somewhere far away, I imagined my family sitting around their own table, perhaps realizing too late what they had lost. But that was their story to live, not mine. Mine was here among people who saw me, who asked nothing but truth. And though I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, I knew this. I'd built something real, something whole. As the waves kept rolling in steady as breath, I smiled into the quiet and let the night hold me. What came next would belong entirely to me. By the time spring came around, the town had begun to feel like a second skin. The rhythm of life was slower there, easier to breathe in. I spent mornings painting in the sunlight that poured through my cottage windows, and afternoons walking the shoreline until my shoes filled with sand. Some evenings, Margaret and Ruth would stop by unannounced with fresh bread or a bottle of wine, and we'd sit on the porch trading stories until the tide came in. I had built something steady, something honest. For the first time, the quiet no longer reminded me of what I'd lost. It reminded me of what I had finally found. Then one Thursday morning, a letter arrived. My mail usually held nothing more than small-town flyers or notes from the scholarship board, but this envelope was different. Thicker paper, familiar handwriting. I recognized my mother's cursive before I even opened it. My hands hesitated above the seal, tracing my name written in her looping script. The postmark was from Ohio. I took a slow breath, broke the flap, and unfolded the pages. The first line was simple: "We miss you." Below it, her words flowed carefully, as if she'd rehearsed them many times before writing them down. She said they were proud of what I'd accomplished, that they'd seen an article about my company's success online, and that they just wanted to make things right. She didn't mention Christmas. She didn't mention the house or the SUV. But at the bottom she wrote, "You'll always be our daughter, no matter the distance." There was no apology. Not really, just a hope that the years of silence could be softened by a few carefully chosen sentences. I folded the letter, set it on the table, and stared out the window toward the ocean. The waves were calm that morning, their rhythm slow and deliberate. I wanted to feel something: anger, relief, forgiveness, but what came instead was clarity. They were reaching out not because they understood, but because time had finally caught up to them. That weekend, while helping at the playground site, Ruth noticed the quiet hanging over me. "You look like you've got something on your mind," she said, handing me a water bottle. I smiled faintly. "Just heard from family," I replied. She nodded, not prying, just offering the kind of silence that makes room for truth. "Whatever it is," she said, "remember that you're allowed to protect your peace." Her words stayed with me long after she walked away. A few days later, another letter came, this time from my father. His tone was different, straightforward but uneasy. He wrote about retirement plans that hadn't worked out, about how the house in Florida wasn't theirs, after all, how Jason had been struggling at work. He ended with, "We'd like to visit if you're open to it." I read the line twice, then set the letter beside the first one. The contrast between their words and their years of silence felt almost surreal. That night I sat at the kitchen table with both letters spread out before me. The smell of salt drifted through the cracked window, mingling with the scent of drying paint. I thought about the girl I'd been at 7, the teenager working late shifts, the young woman who called home with news of her success only to be brushed aside. Each version of me had waited for this, some kind of recognition. Now that it was here, it felt hollow. The following morning, I walked to the edge of the cliff trail near my cottage, carrying the letters folded neatly in my hand. The ocean stretched wide and endless below the sun, breaking through thin clouds. I stood there for a while, the paper warm against my palm. Then I opened my fingers and let the wind take them. The pages lifted, spun once, and disappeared into the sea breeze. It wasn't defiance, it was release. That evening, Ruth called to invite me for dinner at her bakery. "Nothing fancy," she said, "just pot roast and too much pie." When I arrived, the long table in the back room was already filled. Margaret, a few volunteers from the playground, a local fisherman and his wife. They welcomed me like family, making room, passing dishes, asking about my latest painting. Laughter filled the air, bright and warm. Somewhere between dessert and coffee, I realized that this table, mismatched and unpolished, was what family was supposed to feel like. A week later, a knock came at my cottage door. My first thought was another delivery, but when I opened it, I froze. My father stood there holding his hat in his hands. Behind him, my mother lingered on the porch steps. The wind off the ocean whipped through her hair, and she looked older than I remembered. For a long moment, no one spoke. Finally, my father cleared his throat. "We drove up from Ohio," he said quietly. "We thought we could talk." My mother's eyes searched mine. "We just want to see you, Nora." I stepped aside, letting the doorframe block most of the view into the house. "You could have called first," I said evenly. My mother nodded. "We didn't think you'd answer." The air between us felt fragile. They both looked tired, their faces marked by the weight of years that had gone unspoken. I gestured toward the small bench near the porch railing. "You can sit for a bit," I said, but I don't have much to say." They sat close together, their hands clasped. My father started to speak, stumbling over words that had never come easily. He said they regretted how things turned out, that they hadn't meant for me to feel forgotten. My mother added softly, "We thought you didn't need us anymore. You were always so capable." I met her eyes. "That's what you told yourself to sleep at night," I said. "You confused my strength with not needing love." She swallowed hard, her eyes filling. "We didn't know how to fix it." I took a breath, the ocean roaring faintly in the background. "You can't fix 30 years of silence with one visit," I said. "But you can stop pretending it never happened." My father nodded slowly. "You're right," he murmured. "We were proud of you, even if we never said it." The honesty in his voice surprised me, but it came too late to fill the space it had once been meant for. I looked at them both, their faces lined by time and regret. "I don't hate you," I said. "I just can't keep reopening wounds that never healed." For a long while, the only sound was the wind. Then my mother whispered, "You really aren't coming back, are you?" I shook my head gently. "No, I already found where I belong." When they stood to leave, my mother touched my hand once, barely a brush, and said, "Be happy, Nora." My father nodded in silent agreement. I watched them walk back toward their car, two figures growing smaller against the backdrop of the sea. When the sound of their engine faded down the road, I stayed on the porch, the wind cool against my face. The ache that rose wasn't grief, it was closure. They had finally seen me, even if too late, and I no longer needed to be seen by them to feel whole. The sky deepened into twilight, streaked with lavender and gray. I turned back toward the cottage, its windows glowing warm against the darkening horizon. Inside, my paintings lined the walls, each one a reminder of the life I'd built with my own hands. I closed the door gently behind me, knowing that chapter had ended for good. Still, a quiet thought followed me as I poured a cup of tea and sat by the fire. Family had brought me pain, but it had also taught me resilience, self-worth, and the courage to start over. And maybe that, more than anything, was the justice I'd been searching for. Outside, the tide kept its rhythm against the shore, steady, unbroken. I lifted the cup, feeling the warmth seep into my fingers, and whispered to no one in particular, "It's over." But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't an ending. It was the beginning of peace. Summer arrived quietly along the coast, the kind that crept in through open windows and lingered on the porch railings. The sea mist no longer felt cold. It carried the warmth of sunlight and salt. My cottage had settled into its rhythm, paintings drying near the window, half-read books, stacked beside the armchair, a guitar resting against the wall. Life had become simple, almost tender. Each day began with the ocean's hum and ended with the soft flicker of candlelight. Weeks had passed since my parents' visit. I never received another letter, but I hadn't expected one. The silence that followed wasn't painful. This time, it was peaceful. I imagined them driving back to Ohio, talking quietly, maybe realizing how much space had grown between us. Whatever they were feeling, it no longer belonged to me to carry. I had finally learned that closure doesn't always arrive as an apology. Sometimes it's just the moment you stop needing one. My work in town kept growing. The playground project finished ahead of schedule, and we celebrated with the kids racing across the new slides, their laughter echoing through the park. I donated funding for another build in a neighboring county, but no one outside the team knew it came from me. The joy wasn't in the recognition, it was in knowing something good existed because I helped make it happen. Margaret often teased me about keeping my success quiet. "You could own half this town," she said once, smiling. Maybe I told her, but I like it better this way. That fall, she invited me to show my paintings at the local gallery. The evening of the opening, the small room filled with neighbors and soft music. My seascapes lined the walls, each one a reflection of this new life, the shifting tides, the golden light, the endless horizon. I stood in the back listening to people talk about the colors, the calmness, the way the waves seemed alive. Margaret touched my arm gently and whispered, "You've built something beautiful, Nora." I smiled. "So have you." Later that night, when the guests were gone, I locked the door and stepped outside. The sky was deep and clear, stars scattered like salt over black velvet. I walked down to the shore, the sand cool beneath my feet, the water brushing close enough to wet the hem of my jeans. I thought of all the versions of myself that had led me here. The quiet girl with the hand-me-down jacket, the college student coding by lamplight, the woman who once mistook silence for strength. Each one had survived so the next could breathe a little easier. I didn't regret walking away. Distance had shown me that love built on conditions was never love at all. Family wasn't about obligation or history. It was about presence, about people who choose you without needing anything in return. I had found that with Ruth's easy laughter, with Margaret's kind patience with the children whose joy didn't ask for perfection. Somewhere along the way, I'd stopped being the girl trying to prove her worth. I'd become the woman who knew it. That winter, I decorated my tree early. Friends filled the cottage with music, conversation, and the smell of fresh bread. Ruth brought her famous pie, and Margaret insisted on hanging the star at the top of the tree herself. When the night wound down and the laughter faded into soft murmurs, I stepped outside for a breath of cold air. The sea was calm, the moonlight spreading a path of silver across the waves. My phone buzzed in my pocket, another message from my brother. Just a few words. Thinking of you. Merry Christmas. I read it twice, then typed back, Merry Christmas, Jason. Take care of yourself. It wasn't reconciliation, but it was enough. Sometimes peace doesn't mean going back. It just means standing still and feeling no anger. I set the phone aside and looked toward the horizon, the same place where my life had finally started over. The world felt wide again. I had learned that strength isn't loud, it's quiet, patient, built in the small moments when no one's watching. Justice, I realized, wasn't about winning. It was about reclaiming what had been denied: respect, dignity, self-worth. I had done that in my own way, one step at a time. As the wind swept across the porch and the last lights flickered inside, I whispered a simple truth. I'd waited a lifetime to understand I hadn't lost a family. I had built one, not through blood, but through kindness, choice, and courage. The waves rolled in steady rhythm, carrying the sound out into the dark. I took a deep breath, feeling both grounded and free. For the first time, my story didn't end in longing, it ended in peace. Before I went inside, I glanced back at the ocean and smiled. Thank you, I said softly, though I wasn't sure who I was speaking to, maybe the tide, maybe the girl I used to be. Then I closed the door behind me, letting the warmth of my home fold around me like a promise. And if you've ever had to walk away to find yourself again, remember this: you didn't give up, you grew. You learned that love should never make you smaller. Take a moment to breathe, to reflect. And if this story found you at the right time, share it with someone who needs to hear that it's never too late to start over.